Hi, and welcome back to the second video in the third lecture of Covidenomics. In this video, we're going to be looking at decision trees. We're going to be explaining what a decision tree is, and then we're going to be designing a pretty simple sort of decision tree for the government when it's thinking about its policies to address the pandemic. However, over the second part of this video and over the next set of videos, we're going to be making that decision tree more and more complex, bringing in more and more ideas. So the one we're going to be doing today is about the credibility of an action, whether a government or any other party should really take a certain action or believe that something will occur in the future, whether it's credible or not. Let's start by running through the elements that make up a decision tree. The first thing is we're going to need a set of nodes. Now these are points in time where decisions are made. We're going to have branches that connect these nodes. The first node in the decision tree, or the initial node, is going to start the process off, and there can only be one of them. We're going to have a set of terminal nodes. Each of those terminal nodes is going to be associated with a specific outcome, which will often be in terms of a payoff to the person or the people involved in the decision. Each of the branches that will come off a node will represent one and only one mutually exclusive action. Note that if one of the potential actions is do nothing, that has to be represented by a branch. And finally, every node can only have one branch leading to it. In other words, the tree will represent a set of unique histories, so that when we get to a terminal node, there is only one way we could have got to that node. Formally, a decision tree involves only one player, as I'll call them. But even that's sort of a bit unclear, because you may be dealing with multiple versions of yourself. So it's yourself today versus yourself in the future. That's going to be important when we talk about credibility. Nature may also be a player, in inverted commas. Nature's going to be very simple. If there's some uncertainty, then nature will simply resolve that uncertainty at the relevant period of time, and that will lead to branching in the decision tree. It may be the situation that you don't know something about the decision. In other words, you actually don't know where you are in a decision tree at a point of time. That can be represented, although we're not going to do that in today's video. The final point is that decision trees can have multiple players. When they have multiple players, we're in a strategic situation, so we're actually in what's called a dynamic game. So in that situation, it's actually called a game tree rather than a decision tree. We want to set up the decision tree which is associated with each of the endgames that we talked about in the last video. So just to remind you, endgame 1 was the elimination of the virus, so the action that's associated with that virus we're going to call A1. It involves very strong restrictions, locking down the economy hard, stopping a lot of businesses from operating, stopping people from moving around. The objective is to get the infections down quickly to 0 so that we can open up the economy again, albeit with the borders remaining shut. Endgame 2 was our flatten the curve hard endgame. The action associated with that, A2, they're going to have strong restrictions, not as strong as if we want to eliminate the virus, but the objective here is to get that reproduction number down to around 1. Our third endgame involved the flat softening of the curve. The action there was A3, which is a softer set of restrictions, and the objective is to get down to an acceptable rate of new infections under this endgame. And finally, endgame 4, let the virus run. The action associated with that was few, if any, restrictions. The objective is to get to herd immunity as quickly as possible. Let's start with the simplest possible decision tree to represent these 4 actions and the 4 outcomes. So we have our initial node back here, and we have 4 terminal nodes, and each terminal node is associated with one, but only one action. So eliminate, reproduction number approximately equal to 1, managing that reproduction number so that you get an approximately constant rate of new infections, or get to herd immunity threshold as fast as possible. And so each of our 4 branches has associated with it the particular action that will lead to the relevant outcome. And these are mutually exclusive actions, the way that we've drawn them here. A government can't do a hard lockdown and let it run at the same time. But this decision tree is pretty clearly overly simplistic and not very useful. Even back here at our initial node, where the decision time was probably around early to late March in Australia, slightly earlier in some other countries, slightly later in some other countries. But around March, there were a lot of things that we didn't know, and we haven't taken account of any of them in our decision tree here. We also haven't done something that's really important, which is to actually say which of these outcomes is preferred. We haven't put any numbers here, so we don't know whether we prefer to eliminate or we prefer to get to herd immunity threshold. So we've got some things that we need to add into this simple decision tree. So let's start by focusing off on just one branch, and that's the branch that involves action 4, getting to our outcome 4, which is getting to herd immunity threshold. And the reason why this one's a good place to start is that even in early March, the evidence was pretty clear that if there aren't any restrictions in place, then the number of infections, the number of critical infections, and the number of deaths would pretty quickly overwhelm the hospital system. And indeed, the actual evidence from overseas is that that is what happened in a number of countries that where the virus was able to take off. You had temporary morgues set up, you had temporary hospitals set up, and that's still arising in some countries as this virus progresses through the world. So the question I want to start off with is to say, given this information which was available early in March, is it credible for the government early in March to make the decision, let it run? Now, to analyse that, I've got to tell you exactly what credible means. In terms of a decision tree, an action is a branch from a node. So a player reaches that node and can take that action. An action is only credible if, when that node is reached, and remember, that node may not be reached in playing out the decision tree, but if that node was reached, then the relevant player would find taking the action optimal. Now, one assumption in there is we're going to assume that the relevant player is rational. So when we say optimal, we're saying that that action will lead to the best outcome for the relevant player. Just below here, I've got a scene from the Mel Brooks film Blazing Saddles. This is the scene where the white township decides that they're going to lynch the black sheriff. The black sheriff responds by pulling out a gun and saying, "If you don't let me go, I'm going to shoot myself." The townsfolk who were about to kill the black sheriff then put their guns away and they step down rather than have that terrible act occur in front of them. It's a really funny film. Suggest you see it if you haven't. But it's also a great example of an incredible action. And economists find that funny, which may say more about economists than anything else. Here I've got a pretty standard example of an incredible action. So we've got 2 players, A and B. And player B goes up to player A and says, "Give me $100. A says, "Well, what happens if I don't give you $100? And player B says, "Well, I've got a gun here, I'm going to shoot myself. If you don't give me $100, I'm going to shoot myself." What should player A do? Let's draw the decision tree, or because we've got more than one player, this is called a game tree for this interaction. So here we have player A is the initial node. Player A can either give $100 to B or not give $100 to B. If player B doesn't get the $100, player B has a choice. Player B can either shoot themselves or not shoot themselves. If player A gives player B the money, player B could still shoot themselves, so that action still exists, but they also could not shoot themselves. And we need some payoffs here. So let's assume that the cost to B of shooting themselves is minus 10,000. And let's assume that if A gives B the $100 and B does shoot themselves, A doesn't take the $100 back off the dead body. So what are the payoffs here? Well, if A gives the $100 and B shoots themselves, A gets nothing and B gets minus $10,000. If B doesn't shoot themselves, but they've got the $100, well, A, the blue payoffs by the way are A gets 0 and B gets to keep the $100. What if A doesn't give B the $100? Well, then B can shoot themselves, A keeps the $100, but B gets minus 10,000, and B, if they don't get the $100 and don't shoot, A keeps the $100 and B gets nothing. Now, the best way to solve this game is we work backwards, which is really asking, well, what would B do in certain circumstances? And this is the same really as asking, is it credible for B to say, if you don't give me the money, I will shoot myself? Let's see. Well, let's suppose that we get to this node here. So let's suppose that A has given B the $100. What do we predict that player B will do? Well, that's fairly easy. If player B shoots themselves, they get minus 10,000. If player B doesn't shoot themselves, they get to keep the $100. So in that situation, we would expect that player B would choose not to shoot themselves, and so we can wipe out that top arm or that top branch of the decision tree. We can predict that if player B gets the choice of shoot or not shoot after getting $100, they will choose not to shoot themselves and to keep the $100. Now, let's look at the other scenario. Let's suppose that player B is at this node of the game. So A has not given B the $100. What will player B now do? Now, this is slightly more difficult. Remember, player B has said, if you don't give me the $100, I'll shoot them myself. But let's see if that's realistic or what we would predict that B will do. Well, if B does choose to shoot themselves, they get minus 10,000. If B chooses not to shoot themselves and just walk away, well, they get nothing. Now, nothing is a lot better than minus 10,000. So actually here, we would predict that if player B gets the choice to shoot or not shoot themselves after not getting the $100, then they will choose not to shoot themselves. So we can again wipe out that upper branch in this game tree or decision tree. Player B in that situation will prefer the 0 to the minus 10,000. So we now really have our answer to this issue of credibility. If we believe that player B is rational and we've modelled the payoffs correctly here, then if player B doesn't get the $100, they will not shoot themselves. They will simply walk away. So from A's perspective, when B says, give me the $100 or I'll shoot myself, player A should say, go ahead, make my day. Now that's another film, isn't it? So we can now simplify our decision tree or our game tree simply by removing these upper branches. They are branches that B will not credibly choose if B gets to make the decision. So here's the reduced game tree, and now it's a pretty simple decision from player A's perspective at this initial node. They can either give player B $100 and player B will walk off with $100 and player A will have nothing, or player A can not give the $100 to B and player B will not shoot, player B will walk off with nothing and player A will keep the $100. So we can say that the solution to this game is that A will choose not to give the $100 and B will choose not to shoot. A couple of technical details here. The method of solving the game or solving the decision tree that we've used here is called backward induction, or sometimes called subgame perfection. The solution that we have here is called an equilibrium, but it's called a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. If you go on and do any more game theory, you'll understand those terms much more detailed. Here, just in case you see those terms come up in the literature, you'll know what they mean. The key takeaway here, however, is that when B says, "I'll shoot myself if you don't give me $100 to A," that is an incredible threat. If B actually got to make that decision, B would choose not to do that. And just a little exercise that you might want to carry out, just to make sure you understand the concept. Try rewriting this game tree where B says to A, "Give me $100 or I'll shoot you." And try and see if that changes the outcome. So let's get back to analysing this single branch of our very simple game tree. Action A4, let it run, with the objective of getting to herd immunity threshold. And remember, our fact here is that in early March, the evidence showed that without restrictions, the virus will overwhelm the hospital system. The hospital system will run out of beds. Probably hospital staff will pick up COVID-19 and they won't be able to work in the hospital. They'll be in isolation themselves. Possibly they'll be also critical. People will literally not be able to get the health care that they would expect in a developed country. In that situation, is it actually credible for the government to say, let it run? The game we're going to have here is going to be simple. The government is going to ask itself, well, once we get to that crisis when the hospital system is being overwhelmed, will we, the government, still let the virus run? So here's the game tree that the government has to consider. Back here in March, the government thinks that letting the virus run is actually the best thing to do for the country. But it knows that come July, things are going to look pretty grim for the government. And we're assuming here that the government's going to be a democracy. So the government's going to have to face the voters, perhaps a year or so down the track. It can either change its mind at that stage in July and restrict movement, introduce social distancing, quarantining, mask wearing and so on. And let's say if it does that, if it changes course, it'll have a medium chance of re-election. But during this crisis in July, when everyone's calling on the government to act, if it simply lets the virus run, it gets worse. And yes, we've seen the modelling. We know that it will hit herd immunity. It will die out at some stage. But you're going to have people in panic in your cities during that short run period whilst you're getting to herd immunity. If the government confirms let it run, it will not get re-elected. It will have no chance of re-election. Let's apply our credibility test now by asking what would happen if the government gets to make that choice in July. Well, if the government imposes restrictions, it has a medium chance of re-election. If it continues to let the virus run, it will not get elected. The government wants to be re-elected, so we would expect that the government in July will in fact choose to start imposing some restrictions. So the government in March knows that it is in fact not credible for it to commit to letting the virus run and not changing its mind in July. So here's what we really have in that bottom branch of our decision tree. The government knows that if it tries to let the virus run, it will change its mind at some stage. It will just have the electorate pushing back on it. It will impose some restrictions. And the government also knows, as we do, that if you're going to impose restrictions, it's better to do it early. So we would expect this payoff up here, which I've deliberately left blank at the moment, because really it's three different parts of our game tree. We would expect this payoff to be higher than the restrict later payoff. Even if it only leads to the same chance of re-election, it will lead to less deaths. So we would predict here that the government will choose not to let it run. So our prediction here is pretty strong. It says that bottom arm of our decision tree simply is not a relevant arm, that in fact it involves incredible action by the government. And we're going to be analysing our decision tree without that bottom arm. But there seem to be some counter-examples in the real world. I want to talk about the UK, the US, and Sweden. So the UK, early on in March, initially had a strategy of let it run. However, as the epidemiological evidence came in to say what sort of damage COVID-19 could do, the government of Boris Johnson changed its mind. So really what we can think of there is that the government wasn't quite sure of this topic. It wasn't quite sure how bad this virus would be, as the cockatoos go overhead. It wasn't quite sure how bad the virus would be. And so it did start letting it run. It changed its mind once the evidence was in. Once the evidence was in, it wasn't credible to let it run anymore. It tightened down the economy. The UK's death rate is one of the highest in the world because, of course, that delay, well, we've seen the effect of that delay. It acted rather late, and that led to an increase in deaths in the UK. What about the US? The US seems to be a slightly different case. The US seems to be a very uncoordinated approach. There are particular issues between the President, Donald Trump, and various states. There is an election later on this year, and what's happened is very, very mixed. So overall, some states let it run, some didn't. Some, like New York, moved very quickly to try and lock down the city and restrict the virus. But some other states said, there's nothing problematic here, we'll let it run, we'll let it work its way through the community, it's just like a bad flu. Almost all of those states have changed their mind by the time that I'm making this video and have restricted their communities. It is a very hot political topic in the US, and there are people out demonstrating against the restrictions. So the US, it looks like it actually backs up this idea of incredibility, although there's a lot of local politics going on there that make it very, very messy. But what about Sweden? It's sort of the poster child for the let it run strategy. But the Swedes themselves say that their strategy is often misstated and misunderstood. It's not that they didn't have any restrictions, but quite early on they introduced protocols around social distancing. The idea that, well, if you don't have to go out, don't go out. Try and stay at home more rather than going out to entertainment venues and mixing with big crowds. And that's been so-so in terms of its success. They have kept with that strategy. It has led to a higher number of deaths, so about 5 times the number of deaths per 100,000 people compared to neighbouring Denmark, which had quite a strict lockdown. Its economy has gone better than Denmark, but as we referred to earlier on, the Swedish economy hasn't gone that much better. So have the extra deaths, in economist jargon, been worth it for the economic benefits? It's not clear. They have announced that after COVID-19's all done, they will be having an inquiry into their decision to have a very mild lockdown, and so we'll see what comes out of that. But in that situation, it's not quite right to say they let it run. So the theory as well as the evidence tends to suggest that this fourth branch of our decision tree, that fourth action, let the virus run, get to herd immunity threshold, is probably not a credible strategy for the government. Sweden shows really that you could have a mild lockdown if you do it early enough. That can be credible, but where they really tried to let it run, for example, in certain states in the US and in the UK, they pretty quickly have changed their minds and reversed direction. So, from our perspective, we can eliminate that fourth branch, which leaves us with our 3 other actions: really strict lockdown, hard lockdown, softer lockdown, and our 3 objectives there are eliminate, reproduction number approximately 1, and just manage the infection rate. Next videos, we're going to start looking at these 3 branches in more detail. We're going to start to add more detail about what these payoffs actually are. We're going to try and put them into some comparable numbers. We're also going to introduce some information in here, things that we don't know and will be revealed through the course of the pandemic, and we'll try and look at the different government strategies. But that's all going to be for the next video, and that's going to be the first video of the next lecture. Finally, just some references that I've used in making the last couple of videos and that you might find useful. On the general issues of game theory, decision trees, dynamic games, and so on, Games of Strategy by Dixon and Skeeth is a great reference. A couple of articles here first on the UK, and secondly by Tyler Cohen on herd immunity and this idea of the epidemic yo-yo. Tyler Cohen's article also has a number of links to other really interesting pieces. But that's it for me for now. Talk to you next time.